Well, welcome everyone. It's my great honor and privilege and pleasure to have with us Father Andrew Louth, one of, I would say, our leading theologians of living. A bit of background to Father Andrew. He's an Orthodox priest. He's a patristic theologian. He is emeritus professor of patristic theology and Byzantine studies in the Department of Durham University, the Department of Theology and Religion. He studied in Cambridge, Oxford, and Goldsmith College. He used to teach at Goldsmith College, and he's a fellow of the British Academy and published many, many books, among them St. John the Damascene, Tradition and Originality in Byzantine Theology, which is in fact the main subject we're going to be speaking of, that is originality within tradition. He's written on Maximus the Confessor. He did a wonderful translation of St. John of Damascus's works on divine icons. So welcome, Father Andrew. Great to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you.
So I thought we could explore the theological and ascetical principles that help practicing liturgical artists like myself, but also help commissioners, priests, whatever, to help us understand what authentic liturgical art is, that both draws on the wisdom of the past, but which also draws on the best of our time and place and culture. And by liturgical artists, I'm thinking not just of icon painters, but those involved in creating the whole, as it were, the visual material aspect of liturgy. So that would include architects, the commissioners as well, who brief the architects, musicians. It'll include all the five senses, like the way we use incense, the way we use lighting, so lighting technicians. So basically, the principles that help us create a sense of participation in heavenly worship, I suppose, without merely copying, but on the other hand, not doing anything too bizarre. So with your background in theology, I just wanted us to sort of explore things like the nature of tradition, the nature of originality. So perhaps you could start with how you would describe the essence of tradition, especially in relation to what should be meant when we say we want our liturgical art to be traditional. What does that mean? Does it mean copying? Does it mean, what does it mean? What are your thoughts on this?
I think actually the most important thing is that whatever form the icons have taken, and they've taken various forms over the ages. I mean, even in the Byzantine period, there are paintings, there are mosaics, there are even sort of something between a statue and an engraving. I mean, all these exist, and there's there's the convention of identifying an icon with a board painting on gesso and all the rest of it seems to me is just a sort of modern art historical term and is irrelevant. The expression, the way in which the council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council put it, it talked about paintings, it talked about embroidery, it talked about a whole list of ways in which you can represent the various media that you can use to represent. And so it can't just be that question is perhaps important at various points, but it's not the fundamental question. And I think what I would want to say, first of all, is that the shaping of the Orthodox tradition of icon painting was actually shaped by the purpose for which they were painted, which is to be used in worship, to be used in prayer, and that for instance, the way in which there's a certain idealized shape in icons, or comes to be. It can be explained in various ways, and I remember Jervis Matheson explaining to me that a lot of the idealization of shape, particularly in mosaics, simply because they're a very long way up, and they're on a kind of curved surface, and so if you can't be realistic because it would look unrealistic. You have to create an illusion of realism, but the effect of this also is well, really in what sense? The saints that are being depicted, Christ and the Mother of God, and the saints that are being depicted not as they were, but as they are. We are being invited into their presence through the icon, or they enter our presence through the icon. And so they are the people we pray to, and the people whose prayers we ask for. And it seems to me considerations like that, I think, really quite intangible, but considerations like that seem to me to be fundamental to understanding the icon tradition. It's to say that it can't be understood as a branch of art history, as it were, is what one's really saying is that isn't the basic reason behind the formation of the tradition. Of course, they can be understood in terms of art history, in terms of brushwork and all this sort of thing, but the guiding principle was always that they were going to be objects that took place in objects that had a role in prayer and in liturgy. And the other thing that I'd add to that is that I think that it's I think actually that the icons of the great feasts are primarily liturgical. They're not primarily historical. I mean, the depiction of the Nativity, for instance, the Nativity of Christ in an icon, is what's there is there because it is what is recalled in the feast. And the feast consists both in the Orthodox tradition, that consists of the birth of Christ, the message of the angels to the shepherds, the coming of the shepherds, and also the arrival of the three magi. All of these happened at the same time, and there is also the interesting question, very interesting. Where does Joseph fit? And the sense that in some sense Joseph doesn't quite fit, which is interesting, a sort of point to make, that he's usually depicted as being tempted.
Yes.
Is it everything? Is this really what it is? But they're all part of entering into the mystery of the birth of Christ. I mean, even to the extent of recognizing there is a problem about the fact that Joseph wasn't the father, and that has sort of repercussions on a human level. And similarly, I think also that all of the icons of the feasts, and indeed the icons of the saints, are primarily liturgical rather than historical.
Yes.
And I think that also has governed the way in which they have developed, because I mean that is the way in which the liturgical the tradition of liturgical verse for the feast has borne upon the icon is not official. It's because this is what the icon knows, that this is where it's going to fit. This is what you're going to hear on the days when this particular icon is prominent. And
it also explain, I suppose, why we don't have generally icons on canvas, because they're going to be kissed and fall apart pretty quickly. I've got to be on something pretty robust. Yeah. But there is an Egyptian tradition of painting icons on cloth, but yeah, it affects the materials used for a particular task, doesn't it? If it's going to be on a Bible, often it's in embossed metal, because you know, it's handled, it's touched more than a painted panel icon might. So yeah.
I mean, actually, I can talk about illustrations in Bibles, not of Bibles, that it's the icons that appear both in East and in West in books that are for liturgical use are also determined by the liturgy which they're used, and that's another sort of dimension to it as well. I think that the gospel book has got a liturgical role. The icons that you see are the icons on the outside of it, but many sort of many examples of Tetraevangelia or the Gospel book have illustrations inside of sometimes of the events that are recorded, but particularly the liturgical events that are recorded. And I think that's the idea that this is what what determines the icon is not a tradition about icon painting, about which we have very little information, but a tradition about worship and the context in which it fits. And just
but then this sort of leads to the question, because as a practicing liturgical artist, I know what the works can be used for, but for me, who've got to paint it or craft it, carve it, whatever, my question then is, how do I depict this? So I know there's been a lot of writing recently about the relationship between theology and the form of the icon. Is it okay to paint entirely naturalistically? If there is abstraction, why is it? Some people say the stylistic peculiarities we associate with Byzantine icons are just a slight tweaking of what existed before Christianity. Others say, no, it was a form, a style, as it were, that reflected a new worldview. So what are your thoughts on the relationship between, I don't like the word, but let's use the word style or form, not just of icon painting, but mosaic, and the transfigured reality that it's trying to depict? Do you think there is a link between, as it were, theological, spiritual vision and style, or is that something that's been dreamt up in the last century or so?
Well, just continuing what I was saying, it seems to me that the liturgical context of the icon is the thing that is very apparent, particularly, I mean, more so in the East than in the West, or perhaps it's after iconoclasm, more so in the East and the West. You don't get the sort of, in the Eastern tradition, the kind of a depiction of the days of creation in quite the way that you do in Palermo, the Royal Chapel and the
Yes.
the other one. You don't that reflects another tradition, which I think is also liturgical in origin, connected with the days of creation, as it were, preluding the cycles that come thereafter, the cycle of the week, cycle of the year, and so on. But it's I think, well, I mean, the first thing is that we have actually very little to go on when we talk about the tradition of icon painting, and indeed, the 17th Ecumenical Council says this very clearly, that icons are painted according to the tradition, not according to the will of the artist. But we don't know what this tradition was, and nobody's bothered to tell us. Nobody's handed it down to us. There may have been books like, Dionysius of Fauna in the 8th century, but in fact he is 18th, and he is the earliest in the Greek tradition. And I think that I rather suspect that all the icon painters' handbooks that occur in the 17th and 18th century occur because the tradition is being lost.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, they are.
In that respect, they're actually writing about a tradition that's already beginning to degrade a bit. So in fact, what they're writing about is a transitional phase, not really the earlier phase they're trying
and
to
also
protect.
actually the evidence, actual evidence of prayers that the icon painters say and all of that all belongs to this period when it's actually beginning to collapse. I mean, Tarasov was very good on this, I think, because his particularly the icon and devotion, where he points out that the origin of a lot of this material is actually old believers who were, in fact, very conscious of the fact that they were preserving, or thought they were preserving, a tradition that was being lost, and they thought it needed to be codified in some way, otherwise it'd just be lost altogether.
I suppose this discussion about being more specific about what is a traditional style really starts in the Slavophile period, where people like Fr in particular are trying to, as it were, help traditional iconography to be given a greater metaphysical foundation, as it were. So then they start comparing what they would consider sort of more secular painting with iconography, and then try to explain things like inverse perspective from a spiritual perspective. And so, in a sense, it's only because the tradition was being degraded to some extent that they then had to think, well, what does it mean to say that the tradition has been degraded. But before, as far as I can see, before Papa Florensky, you don't really get this theological discussion on the how, the style of the icon. So we're in a very experimental phase, I think, and there are two different poles, I think. Some say there is no patristic relation between style and theology. We're just making it up. But others say, well, they didn't need to write about it because it was sort of almost in the DNA, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I just go what I said before. I think that it is clear that the liturgical context is very important for the icon, and that you can see it in the icons themselves, and that that's the bit that I think is important, not detailed stylistic questions, which you have very little evidence and or virtually no evidence, and even the evidence we have is often, it just is very puzzling. The famous sermon by Photius on the dedication of the icon that was restored in the Church of Hagia Sophia, which is still there, and I suppose it is, and he talks about it. He talks about the liveliness of it,
Yes, yeah.
all this sort of thing, and and I think that means we have to ask questions about what did he obviously didn't mean what we would have meant by saying that, because that's not what the impression that we get when we look at it. And there's much less that we know at that sort of level than we would like. And I think one just has to bear with that. One thing, just quickly, one of the rediscovery of the icon, Pavel Florensky is part of the story, but the actual rediscovery of icon painting in the Slav world, at any rate, is associated with Leonid Uspensky, who wrote a great deal about it. His history is not very reliable, but like apart from dates and things, but what I think is what grew out of all of this, and actually it was probably earlier than most of it, is that interesting book, The Meeting of Icons, published in 1955 or 6 or something, which starts off with an article by Vladimir Losky on the meaning of tradition and traditions, he calls it. It has, if you read it through, it's got nothing to do with the book really, except at the very end, and it's very much tagged on. And I've thought about it a lot, and I think that it has actually a lot to do with the book, but from a very different perspective. Lossie seems to be asking questions like this: where is the bedrock of tradition?
Yes.
And what is it that is always there and that is always accessible? If we've lost a tradition, how do we find it again? In fact, isn't it a contradiction in terms to talk about rediscovering a tradition or recreating a tradition? And I think that his answer to this lies in the early part of that treatise, where he talks about tradition being silence, and talks about the patristic idea of silence as being that out of which revelation emerges, and that and to understand the revelation, to understand the word of Jesus, you have to be able to hear his silence. And I think what he's doing is, at one level, it seems to me, is saying that is the bedrock of tradition in the Christian tradition, for Christians, is actually prayer. And that to rediscover the tradition, we have to deepen our understanding of prayer, and that would fit with the one historical thing would fit with that, is the immediate link between hesychasm and a revival of the icon at the very end of the Byzantine Empire, at the very beginning of the Russian experience. All of which is most people want to use the word hesychasm in relation to this. I think it's a word that is yeah, I mean, it needs careful usage, because it seems to be I think people are often claiming different things when they talk about the Hesychast influence on the icon.
Yes, I tell my students and try to live as best as I can that fact that an iconographer isn't really aiming to paint an icon of an icon of an icon, but one is trying to paint a saint whom one knows personally, as it were.
Yeah.
So the hesychasm and the skill required must go hand in hand. So one could be a really skillful artist, but if you don't know the saint, don't know Christ, the Mother of God, then it'll be skillfully made, but there'll be something lacking in it. Or one could be a saint but not have the skill, and the image will be lacking in other respects. But I think the great iconographers are saints, because, like a theologian, they're describing a reality that they actually know. So they embody the tradition. Losky, wasn't it, who said that tradition is the life of the Holy Spirit in the church? There's a Pentecostal element to tradition, isn't there? It's not an ossified thing, a set of bones we hand on, but it's the breath of the Holy Spirit being communicated. Yes. It's sort of related to this, talking about the ascetical writers, and this question of tradition and therefore originality, etc. It strikes me the role of imagination has been misunderstood in our secular world. Could you speak a bit about the term imagination in the ascetical writings, because it tends to be pretty pejorative. But I know Metropolitan Gillis does Ware and yourself have written a bit about imagination, how we define it, as being one of the God-given capacities, but it can be misused. But could you speak a bit about the affirmative use of imagination in the icon tradition, and what it means in the Greek, the different nuances there?
I mean, it's true in the ascetic tradition, fantasia tends to be used as something which is a distraction. And the now complete 5-volume English translation of the Philokalia, if you look up fantasia, or fantasy, whatever it calls it, imagination, you will find an attempt, a rather desperate attempt, I think, to give some positive meaning that is said to be found in the texts. The only place I know in the Byzantine tradition where fantasia is used in a positive sense is actually in relation to icons. Both John of Damascus and Theodore the Studite say that if images, that the imagination, the fantasia, is there to interpret images. We interpret images by means of this image interpreting, creating faculty. And that both of them say that if there is no role for this in the salvation of the human being, then there's a bit of the human being that is just being ignored. Both of them, were quite clear about this, that if the whole of the human is saved, then the fantasia must have a role in this somewhere. And this is mentioned in the context of the justification of icons. To say that icons, that painting, that depiction has no role within Christianity would be to exclude a whole dimension of human engagement with the world. And that would clearly be wrong, because Christ came to save humanity as it is, the whole of it, all of it. And there's no suggestion at all in either well, it is just anywhere that the actual faculty of fantasia is fundamentally fallen. I mean, that just doesn't occur, and it doesn't occur to, and John, it's curious. I mean, as far as I know, it's only John and Theodore who make this point. But nonetheless, there is no fantasia is full of dangers, partly because it is something that we can do on our own, that we can and that we can do because we like it, and we find images entering our minds during prayer. They're not helping at all. They're just sort of cluttering up our mind or dragging it off in other directions. I think it has to be said that the Christians have not reflected very much about the notion of imagination. And the most important recent writer who has reflected on imagination is Philip Sherrard,
Yes.
for whom it is central. And what's interesting with Philip is that when he talks about imagination, he primarily draws on Muslim sources.
Yes.
Because Muslim sources, for various reasons, for very much for the same kind of reason, but because imagination is part of what it is. So what is it there for? And they draw on basically on Neoplatonic ideas that imagination is the bridge between the world in which we live and the world that we are trying to find. And that this bridge is for the image. I mean, the basic premise, I suppose, is a statement that occurs in Highness the Areopagite in his letter to the Apostle John, where he says, truly images are, I can't remember the correct, basically images are representations of invisible things.
Yes.
Visible representations of invisible things. And this principle is fundamental to that strand of Christian Neoplatonism, that the images link us to the world, and so link our knowledge of the world, which belongs in the physical world and uses physical things, and that without images we wouldn't have the first step towards apprehension of what is beyond images.
To what extent do you think liturgical art can be understood as like a tuning fork, given that our fantasia can so easily go off and make images that are false in the sense that they don't relate to reality? To what extent can traditional art be, as it were, tuning fork to sort of purify and direct and reconfigure our imagination to accord with actual realities that exist? Like, for example, the way we chant, that there's certain modes, as it were, of chanting to help sort of direct the God-given passions aright rather than in a disordered way. So I wondered if the icon tradition acts a bit like chant, that carries the truth of the word, but helps to sort of purify imagination and give us a bit of a canon, a measuring yard, so that we can discern between images in our head that are relating to reality and those that aren't, that are just fantasy rather than images of things that exist.
And one of the people who's very, very rarely quoted, except by me in this context, is Coleridge, end of the Biographia Literaria, where he talks about imagination as being the echo of the divine I am in the human soul. And that's interesting because in various ways, because it picks up two things. One is that it picks up the idea that imagination, in its most proper sense, is a creaturely representation of the divine name, I am. But also, the divine I am is the divine is the utterance of the God whose words create things. So that the imagination must also be thought of in terms of creativity, which is another term. I mean, the idea of creativity only really comes into thinking about art around about the time of the Renaissance. It's the idea to think of an artists are not thought of as creative. They are thought of though it's more they're not. That's not the primary term that occurs. The primary idea is that at best the artist is able to depict in visible form something that is invisible.
But as artists are fitly joined together.
The artist can see in some way the invisible and represent it in invisible. He's not copying it, because you couldn't copy the invisible, but he is evoking it in some way. So that when you look at a work of art, you're taken from what is depicted and what is available to the senses to something which is beyond the senses.
To what extent, therefore, can a proper use of the imagination be related to the Old Testament prophets, who are also called seers, ones who saw? So sometimes they receive the word of the Lord, but sometimes they receive a vision. It might be in a dream of the evening, or it could be a vision of the day. So there, the imagination, as it were, was more like a receptor of divinely given images. So, so here, the imagination isn't so much an inventor, but as a reflector of things that exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the prophet as a seer means that he actually sees what is taking place in the divine courts.
Mm.
I mean, the real example, the best example in a way is Isaiah 6,
Yes.
the vision of the temple,
Mm.
where he's in the temple, he sees all the wonderful ceremonies that are taking place, the incense rising and everything else, and then he sees where he really is. He really is in the divine presence. The seraphim and the cherubim are there, and it's out of that encounter that he becomes a prophet.
Mm.
And it's also, I think I'm right in saying that the word that the word for word in Hebrew has the idea of reality.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when Goethe says in the beginning was the deed, he is reflecting this idea that the word davar means not only what is spoken but what is real.
Right.
And so and it is the word that creates. And so the and what you the idea that what is real is what you can see is actually very profound in most cultures. That it just occurs in ordinary speech. I see what you're saying.
Mm.
I don't mean you don't mean you see anything, but you mean you understand, you grasp.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that this isn't a model. This is in fact a perception of a profound reality.
You touched on it a few minutes ago. Could you expand on the meaning of originality, not so much as a fantasy out of nothing, but going to the origin of things? And I remember reading with great fascination, I've reread a number of times your article on originality and art in the collection, was it The Orthodox in the Modern World or something? The Orthodoxy in the Modern World. That was really interesting. Could you speak a bit about originality as you understand it in its fullest meaning? Does it relate too much to what you're talking
Since I wrote that, that's an article, I wrote that article a very long time ago, and since
about?
I read all sorts. But in my book on John of Damascus, there is a motto from the great literary man of letters, Greek man of letters, Zizimos Lorenzatos, who says in one of his essays that tradition is keeping close to the originals. It doesn't mean repeating the. In fact, it doesn't. It's the point here. I think is that it is actually having access to what is original, not just copying it. That's the low down, but having access to the original, keeping close to the original is actually what tradition is about. So the contrast, the contrast we tend to work with between, particularly in modern art, where the contrast between originality is something which is not traditional,
Yes.
is something that is being that Lawrence Artis calls in question in this essay, and I think I think that is originality is debased when it means
Novelty, really.
creating novelty, creating something new for the first time. Real originality is having access to what is ultimately real.
I wondered if this is the difference between understanding person relationally. We're made in the image of the Holy Trinity, and therefore I become fully myself in relationship. Whereas if I understand that my identity is seen in opposition to you and to Jock, Jan, and therefore, out of that sense of personhood actually being individualism, then obviously in the artistic sphere, this means that novelty replaces originality, because originality in the sense of being close to the origin is actually a threat. I perceive it as a threat to my difference, to my true individuality. So is there a relationship between personhood versus individualism and tradition understood in the way you're speaking of, originality in the way of going back to the source, and originality being seen as novelty?
I think yes, there is surely a link between those, and they're really. I mean, what we're really doing is well, you can put it in all sorts of different ways, but it's if individuality is asserting myself against the other, then originality is going to fit in with that. Is going to be peculiar to me. Whereas if originality is if we what we are really persons growing out of our relationships with others, then what is fundamental to being a person is not something that distinguishes me from other people, that marks me against them. It is actually discovering something that we have most profoundly in common. And that the thoughts like that, I think, are quite important, really. And one person I go back to a lot when I'm trying to think about these things is David Jones. I mean, his poems, which do often revolve around this sense of what is it to what is a sacrament, and the way in which a sacrament is something that relates to something that is original, but relates to it by reproducing its originality rather than simply copying it. And so, I mean, David Jones belonged to that group at the beginning of the 20th century, where people wanted to talk about art not in terms of copying something, but reproducing in another genre what it was trying to reproduce. I mean, he talks about, particularly in the early 20s, some of his letters, he talks about what is meant by art as reproduce. It's a kind of transubstantiation in a way. It's reproducing in another genre something that is fundamentally real, rather than copying. And that, I mean, I think that you can trace that idea philosophically back to Plotinus, for instance, who criticizes Plato's idea of the artist as somebody who makes a copy of a original. And he said, no, in that case, it would be secondary. It was secondary to the original. The artist is one who can perceive the original and represent it in this changing world.
I found that distinction between representing in the sense of a copy, but the more profound understanding is for representing.
That's right.
Someone who is alive, something that exists. And if 5 people introduced you, Professor Andrew Louth, we'd all do it in different ways, but it's the same person we're introducing to the audience, but we would give different emphases, which would reflect as much of us, the introducers, as it would of you. So could you expand about the Pentecost event, because this relates very much to what you're saying? So it's the one Holy Spirit who descends upon the disciples, and they speak in different languages to the crowds around. And here, I think it's not just the actual linguistic language, but they'd be speaking differently to the Hebrews, to the Greeks, to the Syriacs, as it were, accounting for their different cultural backgrounds. So could you speak a bit about the relationship between all that we've been speaking of, originality, novelty, imagination, the nature of tradition, and Pentecost? What we learned from the scriptures about what Pentecost was, the one and the many, as it were, and how practicing liturgical artists, but also those who commission liturgical art, what could they learn from this in terms of the principles?
I think my first thought, my first thought is this: that art and music, as it were, prescind from the level of the verbal. I mean, if you're going to say something, you have to say it in a language. Some people understand, some people won't. And language is represented as a way of a kind of breaking up humanity, so that it ultimately to break its power at Babel. That before they started building the Tower of Babel, and God stops it by giving them lots of different languages so they can't understand one another, so they can't. Whereas actually music and art speak more directly, don't they? I mean, I'm not. I suspect it's a lot more complicated than it looks, but but it certainly is the case that there are. I don't think we can be sure that music means the same thing to people of different cultures. It probably doesn't, in fact, but it can still speak to them. And the same is true to some extent of art. And I mean, one striking example of this is one of the reasons I think why icons are actually in some ways so much more important in the tradition of Russian Orthodoxy than the tradition of Greek Orthodoxy, is because when the Russians received Christianity from the Greeks, music and art came over immediately. The vast cultural heritage that the Greek Christianity represented came through very partially. And the philosophical tradition didn't really get through to the Greek, to the Russians until the 19th century. And then it came from the West. Because that needed, it depended on translation, and there are no philosophical writings in Slavonic, really. There are sermons, there are hymns, but but a lot of the allusions in the Greek have gone. I mean, all those Greek liturgical poetry is highly elaborate, with lots of acronyms being used, being as a norm in the canons, which just simply fade away in the Russian, and because it's too complicated to present.
In that context, it'd be interesting to know if any study has been done on Theophan the Greek, because he was known as a great philosopher, and there's wonderful contemporary descriptions of him painting while he's discussing philosophy with the crowd sort of gathered, standing in awe at the rapid way in which he painted, because he was, as we understand from the writings about him, that he was a great intellect. But as far as I know, there's no indication of this being taken up after by Russians subsequently.
No, I think that's true. I mean, that in a way sort of represents in a form of story what he could communicate, which lasts, and what he could communicate which doesn't last.
Yes.
His talk vanished in the air. His painting remains, and
interesting.
Speaks very, very powerfully. I mean, I think I'm just about to write the chapter on. Well, say just about to. I better do it by sooner or later. The chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Orthodox Theology. One of the chapters that Metropolitan Kallistos was going to do about the Jesus prayer and the name. Well, he died before he could do it, and so I took over that chapter. He was very enthusiastic about the handbook, and agreed to do 2 or 3 articles, but none of them got done. But what strikes me is that the Russian linguistic philosophy in the 19th century is very different from the West, because it thinks of a name as a thing, if you like. There's not this sense of a word representing something, pointing to something, has got a much more powerful sense in Russian than it has, say, in the German philosophy that it's based on, and leads to the sense of the name. Well, rather, the notion of the idea that the name is something that is not a label, but something deeper than that.
Yeah, it contains that which it depicts, which it indicates.
And this leads to a much more unified sense of the way in which invocation of the name is not just the use of the name in prayer, but actually the creation of of the Jesus prayer. Bulgakov says in his the funny book on the icons and the veneration, icons of veneration. He talks about the Jesus prayer as being something which is given to Christians so that we can utter the Jesus prayer, even alone in our bedroom. And in uttering the prayer, we are in the presence of God.
Mm.
It means that, and leads to the Imaginative controversy, where they want to say that the name of God is God.
Yes, yeah.
And defended by all the great intellectuals of the period, Florensky, Bulgakov, Losiev, all defend the monks of Metathos who were being turfed off by the Tsarist troops, or had been.
The experience of Moses meeting God through the burning bush strikes me. I've done some talks going through the different stages of that. So he sees first all the strange sight of the bush burning without being consumed. Just like the art with a strange art, this liturgical art, we could say, that, as it were, reveals something spiritual through the material bush. So he draws near, and then God speaks to him by name. He addresses him by name, Moses, Moses. And this whole world opens up. But it's that name, Moses. God evokes him, as it were. And then later on, Moses asks, "Oh, what is your name?" So it's as though the relationship isn't complete until there's a name. And of course, when you call someone by name, we're sort of, it's an intimacy to that. We're asking them to come near. And I often tell my students that the writing of the name of the saint when they're finished is the crown of that. In a sense, it's not an icon until the name is there, because we call it a likeness. An icon means likeness, of course, but in reality, in most cases, we don't know what the saint looked like. But when we put the name on, it becomes a likeness, and from that point, it becomes a door, window, or mirror, whatever one calls it, to that saint.
Names on icons of saints are not very ancient. They seem to be post-iconoclast. And before that, I can't think of any examples of names that have not been put on afterwards.
I don't think so. The mosaics in the Rotunda and Thessaloniki, they're about 500s. They have names of the saints. And they're mosaic, they weren't added later.
But for the most part, names are much less common. Right?
Interesting. Yeah. Well, what do you put that down to? Why do you think that would be the case?
I think we don't know, but I suspect it's to do with the way in which the justification of the icon, particularly in the second stage of the iconoclast controversy, made a great point about what is depicted in the icon is the hypostasis. It's not the nature, human nature.
No.
It's the hypostasis. Now the hypostasis is, as it were, the named individual, if you like. And that I think that may be that led to this. Of course, there are also accusations in the iconoclast controversy that some icons that people were venerating were not actually icons of saints at all, but they were pictures of gods, pagan gods, that had sort of found their way into Christian worship for one reason or another. And I think putting the name on was a way of sort of protecting against that possibility. But there is this fact that the idea that what is depicted in the icon is in fact the hypostasis, and that means the particular person, the named person, which
you're not depicting nature, are you? You're depicting the person. Obviously, person and nature go hand in hand, but the link is via the person, therefore the name. Other than,
I mean, you can't depict human nature. You can depict someone's human nature.
Yeah, okay. I presume you've read Visera Pancheva's work, The Sensual Icon, Space, Ritual, and Senses in Byzantium. You read that work of hers?
Which one's that? I mean,
The Sensual Icon. She published it in 2010. But I raise this because she, and I'm just reading it at the moment, she was saying that the word typos for icon became quite dominant after iconoclasm, and the idea of of a type, you impress, you have something that exists, my fingerprint, and I push it into plasticine, say, and that leaves a negative image. It is an image of my finger, but it's a negative one. But then, and she goes into quite a bit of detail, that then you ask the prototype to fill that negative image, so that we have an icon, which is a typos, an imprint of the saint, say. But then we don't just look at the negative imprint. We evoke the saint, as it were, to be present, as it were, fill out that typos, so that we're not interested so much in the negative imprint, but as a means of experience of the prototype. So I found that very interesting, that idea of typos as distinct from image, that they supplement each other. They're saying the same thing in a different way, I suppose. But she emphasizes a lot this term energia, inardgia, not inertia, not energy, but inardgia, which, as I understand it, is this sort of the art object
Is this
invoking the presence of the person. And I suppose she's writing very much as an art historian, but she goes into the multi-sensuality of traditional worship, where you're invited into the heavenly worship and all the senses are creating a very lively sense. It's not just a cerebral thing saying, oh, this action represents this in heaven, but it is actually direct solar plexus, as it were, encounter with heavenly worship, which I found really, really, I mean, that's how we experience worship anyway, particularly when it's done well. So she's trying to get away from, I think she perceives perhaps Leonard Uspensky was a little bit too almost cerebral in his explanation of the icon, where she's trying to restore that direct encounter aesthetically with God through the art in the fullest sense of worship.
Yeah, I haven't read that one. There's the one on the Mother of God. There's icons power. There's the one on the Hagia Sophia.
She's on the Hagia Sophia,
yeah. But I didn't
put up
know.
at Pennsylvania State University Press.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know.
That's one worth
I
reading.
must find that. Yes. Yeah.
We need to finish in about 5 minutes. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that we haven't covered that you think relates to this? Because I'm very much interested in, but really my aim as an iconographer and as a writer and speaker is basically to improve the quality of liturgical art, not just for the Orthodox, but for Anglicans and Catholics, because a lot of my commissions come from Anglicans and Catholics, and they're sort of feeding their way back into a rich visual and multi-sensual worship, especially the Catholics having, that's what we're going to blank wall minimalism. There's a real return now. But I'm very interested working with Chichester Cathedral in trying to get seminaries to have an obligatory course on liturgical art or sensual worship, as it were, not to train priests to make icons, whatever, but just to realize how important it is that worship is not just a word thing, that all 5 senses need to be used. And therefore what principles to have in mind when commissioning it, because I often find that Anglican Catholic priests think, well, we need some art, and they sort of ask a local artist to do something and just hope for the best. There doesn't seem to be any sort of guideline as to how it's used or how perhaps to make the work. That's gradually changing, but I'm very interested in what would be the guiding principles for a commissioning priest or bishop or committee, whatever. Could you sort of summarize a few things if you approach, for example, by a priest saying, well, we've got blank walls, we need to do something with it. Can you give us some principles? How would you respond to that?
I think I'd say that the point of icons in churches, particularly the fixed ones, is to make plain something that is always true. That we worship together with the saints who have gone before us, with the angels in heaven, and we enter into the heavenly courts. And the icons are to remind us of this truth, and to, in some way, not just remind us, but to enable us to sort of feel more deeply this truth. I mean, I just been on holiday in France, and I'm very struck with how absolutely bare most French churches are.
Mm.
They do not know what to do. If they do have icons there, they have a kind of separate room with a little sort of meditation room with an icon, usually of the Trinity and a candle and this sort of thing. It's all, um, but in the church itself, no idea what to do,
Mm.
and seem a bit afraid of doing anything. So it's just
Mm.
all there. I mean, the altar is sometimes quite splendid, but I think, but anyway, it's. But I'm very struck how bare so many of these churches are, um, and um, and how cold they are as well.
Yes.
I mean, icons make it's icons make you feel you're with other people, and therefore
Yeah.
there's a kind of, it's not a temperature warmth, but there's a warmth to the place.
Mm.
Um, and I would think that it's things like that that one should be thinking about. I think that there's a tendency to just think in terms of commemorations,
Mm.
and commemorations, well, they commemoration can invoke the not so much the presence of the living as the memory of the dead,
Yes.
and that's what one really wants is to feel a sense of community with the
Mm.
departed.
When I was living as a hermit on the hills of Shropshire, I converted half a barn into a chapel and frescoed it entirely all around.
Yeah,
And it was beautiful and still is beautiful to
yeah,
witness the effect that that has on people. I mean, it's a very small chapel,
I know, I
but
know.
people, because they were surrounded, they weren't just looking at one image.
Mm,
As it were, the saints were always there,
mm,
and they walked then, these people, and participated in a brief time in something that was ceaseless.
mm,
And the effect that that had on them is really profound. I remember one man who just had brought a big lorry up to deliver about 18 tons of stone. He was a big man, all muscling, tattoos all over, and he asked what I was doing. So I said, I'm making this monastery and I've just frescoed this church. Do you want to have a look? And he walked in and he just began to cry. He said, I've not seen anything like this before. And it wasn't just that it was nice art, but the sense of being surrounded by angels and saints. And I deliberately chose what I call Persian rug colours, sort of, you talk about warmth, sort of
yeah, yeah,
deep
yeah.
blues and earth reds and yellows. But the effect that it has on people to participate, as it were, in the community of heavenly worship is profound. It's as though we feel we're back into being the image of the Holy Trinity, not just an individual rattling around.
Yeah,
We're
yeah,
back into the city of God. We're back into a family.
mm,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's very, very important.
Father, I don't want to take any more of your valuable time. It's been a real joy talking with you. We could go on for a lot longer. But thank you so much for your wisdom and your tremendous experience. And you're quite an artist yourself. You play the harpsichord, don't you? Is that right? I know you have lots of harpsichords.
Well, I've got actually I haven't got a harpsichord. I've got a clavichord and a
Clavichord.
string.
Clavichord, right.
But I do. I mean, my hands are getting very arthritic now. But I used to play. Yes,
Yeah,
my
wonderful.
son plays very well.
Right,
He's
right.
a good
Yeah.
violin player. Um,
It's wonderful that you're not just involved in the written theology, but you're expressing it through music. And I've always appreciated what you've written from a theological point of view about art. And well, as much as I'd like to continue, Father,
yes, you must
we will
sometime.
say goodbye. And so
Thank
what I'm going to do is this will go on my Patreon site, but then later I'll put it on to just on generally for all to listen to on YouTube, but also on the section of the website of Chichester Workshop for Liturgical Art. We have a podcast interviews there. So hopefully many people will be able to listen and hear what you have to say. Thank you,
Well,
Father.
thank you for inviting me. It's very kind of you.
Pleasure.